Hello and welcome to Demand-Driven Matters, the podcast that addresses all things related to demand-driven manufacturing. This is the third installment in our series, 5 Key Elements to Drive Flow. Today we're going to focus on continuous improvement. My name is Pam Bednar. I'm your facilitator today, and with me is John Maher, VP of Product Strategy for Synchronize Manufacturing Software. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Pam. Happy to be here.
Great. Let's get into it a little bit here and just level set for our audience our definition of demand-driven manufacturing. So when we refer to demand-driven manufacturing, we're talking about a synchronized closed loop between customer orders, production scheduling, and manufacturing execution, all while synchronizing the flow of materials and resources across the supply chain. The key elements, John, are synchronization and flow, correct?
That's right, Pam.
Okay, so in previous episodes in this series, we've addressed control the release and synchronized activities. Today, we'll spend some time discussing how continuous improvement drives flow. John, can you talk a little bit about these bullets, maybe some best practices for the first 2 bullets, and then perhaps some real-world examples of how you can advise our audience to avoid stagnation?
Sure, Pam. Starting out with how to direct your continuous improvement efforts, I go into a multitude of manufacturing environments, and one of the questions that I ask is if they have a continuous improvement team, and then if they say yes, then I ask, how do they direct their continuous improvement efforts, or just decide on which continuous improvement opportunities to go after. And a lot of the time the answer is varied, and a lot of the time it comes down to pet projects based on people's intuition or some other metric. And what I always encourage people to do is to really look at continuous improvement efforts based on how they're impacting flows. So whenever there's a disruption to overall global flow, understanding what those disruptions are and how so that you can Pareto them out and know which things that, if you improve them, would have the biggest positive impact on flow. There's plenty of things in your environment that are issues, but are they the issue you should be working on? It's almost impossible to be able to tell that without really understanding how they fit within flow or within the context of flow. The question of who is responsible for continuous improvement, one of the things that's important in a continuous improvement process is this knowledge that people closest to the work are the people who are going to have the best insight into how to improve that process. What they really need is a tool set to be able to do that. So, it's important that continuous improvement people within an organization really see themselves as supporters or facilitators of the continuous improvement process as opposed to the people that do continuous improvement. They should be running the events around continuous improvement and helping to educate people on the tool set for continuous improvement, but they shouldn't be the one driving the continuous improvement. And then avoiding stagnation at another level, there's a couple things here. One is that, you put all this energy into getting the continuous improvement engine going, and that doesn't do well to being shut off, right? So you're constantly moving better and trying to put in this mentality of continuous improvement. And then if you shut that off or let it die off, it's really hard to get that kick started again. Another thing is that within an organization, their level of capability can't stay fixed because the competition is going to be working to catch up. So really what you want is one of your core competencies to truly become continuous improvement. So Pam, it's really important that we get continuous improvement ingrained in the organization, continue to drive it forward, make it really a core competency of the organization, and it's really a responsibility of management or leadership to make people recognize that it's continuous. We've never actually arrived at our endpoint. We just want to keep moving the organization forward.
Got it. So continuous improvement, it sounds like it needs to be ingrained in the culture of the organization.
It really does. You really need to be part of the core of what your organization does. No matter what you're doing, no matter what you're building, no matter what your organization does, continuous improvement should be a core tenet of what you do as an organization.
All right, thanks, John. Let's define continuous improvement for our audience. So here we're talking about a long-term approach to work that systematically seeks to achieve small incremental changes in processes in order to improve efficiency and quality. So I'm curious about the difference between continuous improvement and Kaizen. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Kaizen is really a tool or a methodology that falls into place under continuous improvement. And really, Kaizens are continuous improvement events. So they're really designed to be like short sprints, if you will, of improvement where, you know, I've been to many organizations where their Kaizens are a week and they're expected to get an understanding of the problem, come up with a solution, and implement that solution over the course of that 1 week. So they're pulled out of their regular jobs and really focused on this improvement. It's important to note in the statement incremental changes to the process in order to improve efficiency and quality. When you take a look at it, Kaizen and continuous improvement really is about making those incremental changes. One of the reasons why they limit it to a week is so that you don't pick out something so big that it's going to take forever to get through. And we've all been on those projects that are spanning many months or many years, and they're just too ambitious and they're too large to try and put everything in place. So one of the things that Kaizen allows us to do is maybe we do have this larger directive, but to break it down into consumable chunks so that we can get through things, so that we can truly understand that problem, and so that we can get some results to show the organization, and then we can move on to the next one. And then through that continuous improvement process, you do those incremental improvements until overall you see a large change. One of the interesting things about continuous improvement and Kaizen is some organizations that I've been into that I know that have been doing continuous improvement for well over a decade, at some point they start to shift from these larger 1 week events into what they call daily Kaizen, where really they've trained up through having people go through enough of the larger Kaizens on all the tools of continuous improvement, and it just becomes expected that individual employees or groups of employees will just identify waste within the organization and figure out how to resolve that waste without having over a larger Kaizen. And for organizations that do this, about 80% of their ongoing improvements come from these daily Kaizens. And the only real reason why they pull the larger group together and have one of these week Kaizens is if it is something that's cross-functional, that goes through different areas of the organization, and it's important to have people together. But really they are designed to be a 1 week or short time period thing that does incremental improvements. I've also been in organizations that I've been invited to their Kaizen events, and I find out that Kaizen really means just a long meeting. And in those types of events, right? So it's important to understand the reasons why organizations, why Kaizens were laid out to be short events where you get through all the way from understanding the problem to coming up with a solution to implementing that solution.
That makes sense on so many levels. You know, the short sprints would also seem to avoid stagnation that we talked about earlier. You know, it also
cut down on the fatigue of the project.
Yeah, and you get, you know, you can see some of the progress sooner too, I would imagine. You know, you get those little wins.
Like a reinforcing loop.
Exactly. Okay, great, that makes sense. So, okay, John, I thought this was interesting. It's from an Aberdeen study on demand-driven manufacturing. And here they note that 31% of the respondents indicated a key demand-driven strategy is to increase the effectiveness of their continuous improvement efforts. Does this surprise you? Does it seem in alignment with what you've experienced?
So Pam, looking at the chart as a whole, I find it interesting in that there's a lot of interrelated things within this chart. Really, when I think about continuous improvement, and as we talked about earlier, like understanding your disruptions to flow, one of the things to truly understand that are some of the other points on this chart. One of synchronizing demand signals with manufacturing execution, or I'd call that enabling pull, and optimizing work in progress, or your WIP, to make sure that it's the right amount of work in process on the floor and make sure that it's the right work in process on the floor. And really those two things are critical in order to be able to increase the effectiveness of your continuous improvement team. Yes, your continuous improvement team needs to be, well-grounded, well-educated in the tools of Kaizen and continuous improvement. But if we're going to do, like I suggested earlier, direct your continuous improvement efforts around flow and what's disrupting the flow, you can't get a clear picture of that without synchronizing your demand signals to manufacturing execution and optimizing your work in process, because anyone who's worked in a world where there's way too much work in process, way too much inventory, it just kind of puts you in the dark as far as what the real problem is, because inventory basically hides or clouds your vision of that. So you really need to achieve those first, otherwise you don't know whether you're really impacting global flow or if you're just running into wandering bottlenecks throughout the process.
Got it. So John, you've been in hundreds of different manufacturing environments, different industries, different methodologies. When you walk into a new environment, are you able to quickly kind of pinpoint where they should be focusing their continuous improvement efforts? What I'm asking is, is it obvious to you?
Well, it's obvious to me when the first one on there is synchronizing demand signals and optimizing work in progress are not being accomplished in a manufacturing environment. Mm-hmm. That for sure is very obvious to me. As far as knowing where to focus continuous improvement, that is something that you cannot tell just by walking around. You can see which machine or areas, might need 5S, might need PQM, might need other things, but you don't really know the impact of those problems on global flow until you've done steps 1 and 3 on there, or items 1 and 3 on there, and started tracking what's really disrupting flow. Because I can walk around and point out problems,
sure,
and see problems, but as far as what's the problem they should be working on next,
right,
you don't really know that until you put it within the context of flow.
Good. All right. Thanks for that insight. When thinking about that Aberdeen study, where demand-driven manufacturers are looking to increase their continuous improvement efforts, can you provide a little bit more insight into how demand-driven manufacturing as a method can do this? And perhaps some examples of how you've seen continuous improvement efforts improve flow?
Sure, Pam. As you know, these two items are very interconnected. As I said in the previous slide, some of the core tenets of demand-driven manufacturing, like synchronizing manufacturing execution with the demand on the plant and optimizing work in process, are critical to be able to really see into the disruptions to flow, but also continuous improvement is really critical to demand-driven manufacturing, because part of demand-driven manufacturing is to become more agile and flexible as a manufacturer, and without continuous, you can't do that, because what you want to do is get closer and closer and closer to the actual customer pull. And if you have large monument assets that take a day to do changeovers on, it's going to be very difficult to get to that point. So continuous improvement and Kaizen really give us the tool set to start improving at that local level with a view to overall global flow. And that continuous improvement is really at the heart of what we need to do to truly become demand-driven, because we have to become more flexible in our ability to deliver to the customer, because the customer demand is going to fluctuate and we need to be able to be agile enough to respond to that.
So John, within the context of what we've been talking about here, are there any other issues that seem to get in the way of continuous improvement?
Yes, Pam, there's two big ones, one of which we'll be addressing in one of our upcoming podcasts. But really, when you start going down this path of demand-driven manufacturing and you start getting into continuous improvement, a couple of things that you're going to run into, which can be the most challenging of things to take care of. You know, the physical changes, oddly enough, are sometimes the easiest. One of the things that you'll run into is what I would call the sacred cows, or the policies that have been in the organization for a very long time, where the person who created that policy may or may not be long gone from the organization, but it continues to live on. And being able to slay those sacred cows can be rather difficult. The other piece, which we'll be covering in upcoming podcast, is metrics. At some point, some of the things that we're doing here could really start to impact some of the metrics that you may currently be using in a negative way. And it'll be important for the organization to understand that and to make sure that the metrics that they're analyzing and measuring people on are driving the behaviors of demand-driven manufacturing and continuous improvement, rather than reinforcing the things that you're trying to get away from.
Got it. That makes sense. I think from what I understand too, we're also going to introduce a couple new metrics specific to demand-driven manufacturing.
Very true.
Okay. All right, so let's wrap up here. For our listeners, there are additional resources on demand-driven manufacturing and access to previous podcasts at synchrono.com/resources. Next up in our series, 5 Key Elements to Drive Flow, we'll talk about extent of a supply chain and how to synchronize from the factory out. And as we alluded to earlier, we're going to talk about metrics in our 5th installment. We'll introduce you to 4 categories of metrics that drive action in demand-driven manufacturing, and introduce you to a couple new metrics. Well, thank you, John, for your time this afternoon, and thank you, our audience, for listening in, and tune in next time.